Hello, class, and welcome to what I believe is now week 5, where we continue with cost management. So, last week we looked at cost estimating, and I believe by this stage you have a good introduction to what estimating is. I think really estimating is one of those tasks where there's a little bit of theory to be learned, but really there's a lot of practice and experience and wisdom to be gained from being on the job. So you're going to get better as an estimator as time goes on. Now, this week we're going to be looking a little bit further into cost management. We're going to be looking at how do you budget and how do you track the expenditure on a project. That'll be next lecture. But this lecture we're going to be looking at the process of tendering. So we're going to be talking about what is tendering and why do we do it, what is the process involved in tendering, and also what are some of the key sections in tender documents. What are the key subtitles in a tender document? And we're going to be talking about why we tender when we are procuring, when we're buying certain services inside a civil engineering project, and why we would tender for those services. We're also going to be talking about when you have multiple bidders, meaning there's multiple people who have bid money to do the work that the tender has presented. How do you assess those bidders, and then how do you choose which bidder you are going to award the contract to? So remember, procurement, this is a term we learnt in engineering economics. Procurement is basically another word for buying. So at the University of Kurdistan, we actually have a procurement office, and another name for that could be the buying department. It's run by Mr. Hawakar Lasad. He's upstairs next to the finance office and just before the human resources office in the blue building at UKH. And that department, they are responsible for buying everything for the university. So when I want supplies for the lab, for the building materials lab, and I want concrete and aggregates, I put in a request, I get it approved by my line manager, Dr. Joseph, and then that gets sent to procurement, and they are responsible for buying all of the materials for the lab. Also, part of my contract conditions, as with all of the foreign staff at the university actually buys a flight for me and my family to fly home to my home country every year. And the procurement office is responsible for that, for buying flights home. And it's not just for materials, it is also for services. So all of the contractors who are doing construction work around the campus, they've had their contracts signed and approved by the procurement office. It's basically when sponsors or contractors buy materials and services in order to complete the project. That's what procurement is. And tendering is a way where you can basically fish out appropriate contractors, appropriate sellers for actually carrying out that work. So tendering is where you are basically, as the project sponsor or sponsor representative, you don't necessarily need to be the sponsor, you send out an invitation to prospective project team members, because they will become part of the project team, even though they're part of different organizations, to execute a certain part of the scope of work or the entire scope of work potentially and that's got to be at appropriate cost, time and quality constraints. And this invitation is called an invitation to tender or a tender notice. So you may have seen pictures like that on the right. Sometimes they will have invitations to tenders in newspapers. This day and age, though, often it's done online. And I will show you a few examples of invitations to tenders later in this lecture. But yeah, it's basically a way for the work to be auctioned off to prospective project team members, to prospective contractors, and then later, when they've made their bids, you would assess their bids not only for the cost that they are willing to do the project for, but you also assess their CVs, their experience, because you want the work done to a certain level of quality, and also if they have a reputation for finishing work on time or not. Those are part of the tender evaluation process. So just a little bit of definitions. In this lecture, when I talk about the tenderer or the contractor, that means the seller. That is the person who is actually bidding for the work. And the engineer, when I use that term, I'm talking about the person who is basically buying the work, who's going to assess the different bids from the different contractors or sellers, and then decide who gets to do the work. So remember, whether you are a buyer or seller, the chances are you're still working under contract, so you are technically a contractor. And usually in the world of civil engineering, both of you have a background in civil engineering and you are an engineer. But the terms I'm going to be using here for this lecture is the engineer, he is the buyer, and the contractor, he is the seller. And the reason I'm using those terms is in tender documents, which tend to be legal documents, these tend to be the terms that are used when referring to the engineer or the contractor. It is the buyer and the seller, respectively. So there's basically two different kinds of tenders. The first tender is what we would call an open tender. And this is where the work that needs to be done, this is basically defined and verified between the engineer and the contractor or a prospective contractor. And sometimes it's advertised, sometimes the engineer just phones up the contractor he intends, and basically you work out what needs to be done with the contractor, and you agree an acceptable price. You may negotiate. Now that's normally done for small amounts, for small projects or small work packages. If it's a really big project, though, and it goes into the millions of dollars, which civil engineering projects, they do have a tendency to do that, you need to basically form what is called a sealed tender. Now, if you are the sponsor or the sponsor representative, as the engineer, you will be inviting people to bid for this work. And this means that you need to write out very clear, detailed specifications on what the work is. You also need to talk about what kind of contract will be awarded, what kind of conditions there will be. Just as we talked last week, you need to include all of that in the tender documentations. And you then need to send out those documents to contractors who have expressed an interest in bidding for this project. And then they need to submit their bid, their tenders, at a very and it's very important they deliver it by the deadline, and only at the deadline can you then open the envelopes and assess the tender documentation. Now, all of the other contractors, they have no knowledge of what others are bidding. And so that's why it's very important for integrity that you do not open the document. It needs to be sealed until the agreed tender evaluation day. Otherwise, you could potentially tell other contractors and they could undercut the other contractors. You don't want that. It would be a bit like if I said, okay, the deadline for assignment 3 is May the 24th, but Taba, she submits her assignment on the 20th, let's say. And that's a good thing to do. It's always good to submit as soon as you've finished working on the assignment and not waiting. But what would happen if I then looked at her assignment on the 20th, marked it, and then I gave her feedback with everyone else in the class, and I said, yeah, this answer you gave isn't actually appropriate. You need to give a more detailed answer here, or you've done too much work here. You didn't need to do that much. Well, for Cardo, Ivan, and Yav, they're going to be listening and they're going to think, wow, this is great, because they've now been given inside information. And so they can actually refine their assignments before the 24th, the deadline. Now, that probably doesn't matter too much because it's assignments and education isn't a competition. But if there was a prize for the best mark in the assignment, well, Taba is going to be rightly fairly miffed because she didn't have a fair playing field. Well, it's the same with tendering. If someone who submits their tender early, a contractor, has his tender evaluated and information about his evaluation and his tender is made known to other contractors, well, the other contractors can improve their tenders and it's not a level playing field. The other thing I need to let you know is that contractors could be limited or unlimited, meaning that the invitation could be an open invitation for anyone to tender, or there could be a pre-approval where only tenderers who you know are contractors who you know are capable of carrying out this work, they are personally invited to submit their tenders, their bids for the work. So that's what I mean when contractors may be limited or unlimited. It may be an open invitation, or it may be a discrete invitation to just a few selected companies. So remember, tendering is basically what happens before a contract is agreed. You are basically putting down, the engineer is basically putting an offer of a contract out in the form of a tender notice, and it's a legal and defining document, meaning you can't take it back and then the contractor he fills in the tender documents, and he fills in the acceptance of the work, meaning that once he's agreed to do the work, it is legal and binding, and it becomes a contract. The tender documents become a contract the moment the engineer and the contractor, they sign the acceptance letter. And so from that, you've got a contract. So this is why we this is why we can easily subcontract work out to different companies for different parts of the project. You might have one company doing the design work, another doing the construction work, another company doing review work, and so forth. This is usually done through a process called tendering. Now, by tendering, you are basically auctioning out the work, and you are ensuring that you're getting the best the best contractor for the work. And so there's no favoritism, there's no wuster, there's no corruption. So I'm sorry that you've already gone through a life cycle for projects. I'm giving you another life cycle here, which is called the life cycle for tendering. So the first issue is you will be preparing the tender documents. And these are fairly bulky documents. There's a lot involved in these documents, depending on how big the project is. But I remember being part of a tender committee where we had a project which was worth about $20 million. It was for the refurbishment of a generator and turbine for a hydroelectric dam, and our tender documents, they actually came to about 2,000 pages. So I was involved in writing those documents. There was a lot of writing involved and a lot of review. The next stage is you will be issuing a notice inviting tenders. Now, that means you're basically making the tender documents available to contractors or prospective contractors. Now, this could be unlimited, meaning anyone can bid, or you could have a process for pre-approving and pre-selecting key contractors who you know are capable of doing this work. And we'll talk about why you would want to do that later. Then in the tender documents there will be a deadline for submission, and it's so important that if you want to win the contract, you submit the work before the deadline. If the deadline is midday, 12 p.m. on the 31st of December, you make sure you bring in the documents to the place that's agreed before the deadline. And this is one of the reasons why I'm actually a real stickler for deadlines. I don't tend to grant extensions for deadlines for assignments because it's a very unprofessional thing to do in engineering. And if you don't submit your tender before the deadline, that actually opens the door for corruption, and we'll talk about that later too. But opening and reviewing tenders, once the tender committee, the engineers, they have all of the tenders submitted from the contractors, they will open the tenders and they will review them, and they will assess the tenders. And in that evaluation, they are going to decide which contractor they want to hire for the scope of works described in the tender documents. And then they will contact all of the contractors and they will give them feedback and say, we haven't accepted you for these reasons. But they will go to the accepted contractor and say, we want to award the contract to you. And they will accept the contract, and the contract is legal, and then they need to carry out the works according to the terms and conditions of the contract. Now, this could be for a lump sum contract, it could be for a cost plus type contract, it could be time and materials, it could be anything, but it's usually, if you're going to the effort of tender documentation, usually it would have some element which will be lump sum. So the tender documentation, that's going to have a number of different things involved in the tender documentation. First off, it's going to have the name of the project that's inviting the tender. It's going to mention the work and the location of the work. It's also going to designate the officer or the engineer who will be administrating the tender process. So if you've got any questions, if you're a prospective contractor, if you've got any questions about the work, or you need to verify something in the tender documents, that's the person to contact. And it's all got to be an open process. So if you ask a question of me, of the engineer, the officer administering the tender process, he will give an answer to you, but he will also then send out an email to all of those who are tendering, all of the contractors, and say the answer to this question is, even if they haven't asked it. So it would be a situation where in the exam, let's say Yar puts up her hand and she has a question about a query about one of the questions in the exam, and I explain it to her and I clarify it. Maybe I didn't explain the question very well in the exam or whatever, and then I go and sit back down. It wouldn't be fair if I've helped Yar but I haven't helped everyone else. So what would happen is I would make the clarification with the invigilator, and then the invigilator will announce for everyone doing the project management exam, Cardo, Avan, Taba, Lausanne, Yar, there is a clarification on question number 3 from Mr. Collins. And so this way, Yar isn't given an advantage. Again, it doesn't really matter in an exam because it's not a competition, but in a tender, it is actually a competition. Only one contractor can win the work. It will also have the deadline for tenders to be received. Now, why is it really important for you to submit your tender, your bid, if you're a contractor, before the deadline? Well, that is going to be the time that the engineer will open all of the tenders and begin reviewing them and evaluating them. Now, if you do not submit your tender before the deadline, other tenders from other contractors have already been opened and they have begun to be evaluated. Now, if that happens, information from those tenders could be leaked out of the tender committee, out of the engineer's office to you, and you can undercut your price or change your tender accordingly. So if you find out, Cardo, he's said he will do the work for $10,000 and Avan is doing it for $9,500. I'm going to submit my tender for $9,250 and I'm going to win the work. Well, that wouldn't be fair. You also need to, in the tender documentation, there would also be a time of completion, a date that is expected for you to finish the work. Also a time of beginning the work too will often be given. The contract type, whether it's a lump sum, a cost plus type contract, you learned about all the different contract types, and also all of the terms and conditions. Will there be penalties for late delivery? Will there be bonuses for early delivery? Will there be bonuses for exceedingly high quality, and so on and so on? What are the quality standards that need to be met? And then there is something called earnest money to be paid, or earnest money deposit, and security deposit. So this means that this is basically deposits, money that the contractor will give to the engineer, and it's just a deposit. They'll get it back, but we'll talk about why that is later. But that is to be mentioned in the tender documents, in the tender notice. It's also got to be the date and time and place of opening the tender. Basically, you're explaining how the tenders will be evaluated, the where, why, and how, and when, and also the cost of the tender documents. So remember, the tender notice is just an invitation, but if you want to actually have all of the tender documents, you've read the invitation and you think, I'm a contractor who could probably do this work, I think I want to bid on this work, you will request the tender documents. And the tender documents will have all sorts of information in it. But as I said, tender documentation, it can be very large because it's a legal document with specification and so on. The $20 million hydroelectric dam refurbishment that I talked about, that had 2,000 pages to it, as well as drawings and all sorts of things involved in it. Well, I'm not going to give that to everyone who asks for it. If I advertise the tender notice on Facebook, for example, I'm going to have thousands of people saying, yeah, send me the tender documents. And, well, frankly, yeah, most of them are just wasting my time. They're tire kickers. They have no real interest in bidding for the work. So often you will put a small cost on the tender documents, and it's not usually a lot. It's something usually just to cover the printing, and this could be anywhere between $50 to $100 usually, maybe a bit more. But anyway, that will be a way to ensure that you're not needlessly printing off tender documentation for people who have no interest in bidding. Just a small fee to cover the cost of the printing. Now, in the tender documents themselves, you're going to have a lot more detailed layout of what needs to be done, the scope of works, than you have in just the tender invitation itself. So you're going to have what's called a bill of quantities. Sometimes it's shortened to BOQ, and that is basically a breakdown of the work that needs to be done. This is for construction work. You would have the bill of quantities, and it's similar to what you used for making your estimate. It's an itemized estimate, if you like, but it needs to be fairly accurate because you're going to have to you're going to have to charge work at that cost. So if your bill of quantities estimate is underestimating the work, as a contractor you will be making a loss. The tender documents will also include quality standards that need to be adhered to, meaning, hey, we want you to build a road between Rwanda's and Saran, but you can't just build a road any which way. It needs to be built according to the standards of the Ministry of Development of the KRG, and you will reference the quality standards that need to be adhered to. You also need to talk about just the general layout of where the work is taking place. You might give a site layout plan. You need to give information about transportation and the nearest roads. Also access information, meaning, okay, if you can only access the site between 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. because that's when they have security or whatever, you need to report that, because the contractors, they may be pricing the work to be working at midnight, because if it's in the height of summer, they might think we can get our workers to work harder if it's nighttime, potentially. But if that's not possible, you need to make sure you give that information to them in the tender documents. Drawings, That's very important. You need to have the drawings so they know what the work is they're doing. This is for construction tenders, of course. The availability of materials and services in the vicinity. So tell them if there are any materials that they are to utilize that are already on the site. Make sure they know they're available so they're not pricing extra materials to be brought in from elsewhere. Also, services. Is there electricity available for a lot of the machinery on site or isn't there? Let them know that, otherwise they need to provide a generator. A schedule of tools and services to be made available to the contractor, including their rates. Well, if there's lots of different contractors on site, all doing different different contracts on the one project, they're fulfilling different work packages. Well, there's probably going to be some shared resources. There's probably going to be a site toilet. There's probably going to be a site office and a smoko room, a place for the workers to have lunch and so forth. And also tools. There'll probably be one site generator to provide electricity and so forth. Well, you've got to tell the contractor, the prospective contractors, what tools are available, what services are available, and if there's any rates associated with them. So, hey, you can use the generator, but we will make you pay so much for using it, and so forth and so forth. You need to make sure that that's clear to the prospective contractors. And also the expiry date of the tender. So that means when the contractor submits his tender, he is agreeing legally to carry out this work at that agreed price, and it is up to the contractor, the engineer, the buyer, to decide if he wants it or not. Now, of course, it's got to have an expiry date. The buyer can't come back in 15, 20 years' time and say, hey, you know that work you bid for in Mosul back in 2020? Well, I've decided I want to do that project now and you're going to be the tenderer. Well, you're going to be the contractor. Well, that's just not fair because prices have changed, the cost of labour would have changed, the cost of material would have changed, so it's not fair. So there's got to be a required expiry date for the tender as well. And that expiry date for the tender should align with when the engineer, the buyer, wants to carry out that part of the project. He wants to reward the contract. Now, the rate of supply of power and the point of supply, if there's an electricity point on the site where you can use electricity or fuel or gas or whatever, you've got to make the contractor aware of that, and also what is the level of electricity supply and so on. Location of water supply points, the time for completion, along with progress to be made at intervals of time. So you've got to say in the tender documents, this work must be completed before the 21st of November. But also there could be phases of the construction or the design that need to be completed before then. You need to have completed all of the design work for review before 19th of July. And you need to have completed the foundation excavation before September the 1st, and so forth and so forth. You can put conditions in place like that. You can also put conditions of employment for technical personnel. Now, this is actually quite an important one for a lot of projects which are being sponsored by NGOs, and there's a lot of those in North Iraq because NGOs are one of the big sectors for project sponsorship. They have a lot of requirements that potentially, if the government of Iraq or the KRG were the sponsor, they wouldn't care about. And one of them is that they expect everyone working on the site to be working safely. And so part of that is you've got to make sure that all of the people who are employed in your contract, they have good PPE, personal protective equipment, and they're also licensed, and they've got they've got capability to run the machinery. So if I was going to drive a digger in New Zealand, and I was a digger driver for a small time, while I was studying at university, I was earning money by driving a digger. I needed to get a license to drive a digger. You can't just have any old car license. You've got to have a professional license to drive a digger. And so if you've got requirements for the contractor to meet certain conditions, then you need to actually state that in the tender documentation, because all of this is going to influence the price and the bid that the prospective contractors are going to submit. Weather conditions in the area, if you're working in a place which is particularly wet or particularly dry, or the weather could influence the cost and the time and the quality of the project, you need to let the contractors know that. The amount of earnest money deposit required, we'll talk about earnest money deposits in a moment, also security deposits, licenses and consents. If you need to get special government permissions to carry out the work, you need to state what that is. That will be on the contractor's side, his responsibility to get those consents. And also, if there is an insistence on government registration. So this is actually one of the ways that the government, when the government is assessing prospective contractors for tenderers, if you want to submit a tender as a contractor, you need to be registered with the government as a government approved contractor. And this is just one of the ways the government can basically do some pre-assessment of prospective contractors. So if there is an insistence on that, then that needs to be stated in the tender documentation too. The mode of payment, will you be paid a lump sum? Will it be cost plus percentage? Will the payment be paid once the work is completely finished? Or will it be paid in installments? Will you be paid 50% once the foundations are made and 50% when the rest of the work is done, for example? So as well as that, you also have a statement saying that you do not need to, the buyer, the engineer does not have to give a reason for rejecting one tender over another. That's just needed to be put in there as a legal backing. Now, usually there is an ethical thing where we do give feedback to all contractors and say, we thank you for submitting the tender. We appreciated your tender. We evaluated it thoroughly. The reason we're not awarding you the work is because we think you don't have enough experience or the price was too high. And you don't need to go into details, but it means the contractor has not wasted their time because they've gained an education. They've learned what it is they need to improve on, and they've recognized what they need to offer for clients to hire them. Also, penalties for poor time management, penalties for poor quality management. bonuses for good time management, bonuses for good quality management. These should be stated, usually given as percentages of the total project price. If there's shares in the project profits, announce that too. If a portion of the contract is profit share, state that. And also talk about the procedure for variations. What's going to happen if the scope of if the scope of the project changes mid-project after you've made the contract? Well, usually what happens is there will be a portion of the contract where you've got to list out your day rates. These are time and material rates, where you say, well, if there is a variation, the extra time that it takes for us to do that work, you will pay us $25 an hour per labourer. You will pay us $60 for extra cubic metre of concrete, and so on and so on. So remember when we talked about contract types, we talked about time and material contracts. Often those are small clauses inside lump sum contracts for variations. And finally, if there's an arbitration authority in the result of a dispute. What's an arbitrator? Well, an arbitrator is basically a judge among peers. If you can think of, if you go to the court, if let's say that Cardo is suing Avan because Avan Cardo was a contractor and Avan was the engineer who awarded the tender to Cardo, and then Cardo does the work, but maybe not to the best quality, and then Avan refuses to pay the full price that was agreed in the contract. Cardo's going to be angry because he's going to feel that he wasn't paid his fair share, and then he'll take Avan to court, and her defense will be, yeah, but the quality wasn't good enough, and there would be a dispute, and the judge would solve that dispute. Now the trouble is, if you rely on the Ministry of Justice and go to a court, you're going to wait years before you can settle that dispute. And the truth is, the judge is probably not necessarily a good person to judge this. He doesn't have a civil engineering background. He doesn't know what constitutes good quality and bad quality, if the rate that Cardo is asking for is fair or reasonable or not, because he's outside of the industry. An arbitrator is someone who both sides agree will act as a judge and jury if there is a dispute. And it's usually someone within the industry. It will be a third party, so it can't be someone who's on the payroll for the seller or the buyer, the engineer or the contractor. It has to be someone who's not biased, and the two parties will agree, hey, if we have a problem, we agree that this person can arbitrate between us. So first off, what it would be a mediator, and a mediator will be trying to help the two parties come to a compromise that both are happy for. An arbitrator is where they can't come to a mediated, compromised agreement, and basically the arbitrator is making a decision and saying, okay, Avan, you've got to pay Cardo, or Cardo, you need to fix up the finishing work on the paint, or whatever. And the arbitrator will be making a rule that is binding. You sign beforehand that whatever the arbitrator decides, we agree to live by that decision. And that in itself is a legal document. So that's actually one thing that I did in New Zealand once. I was part of an arbitration committee. There was a group of 3 of us. There was a dispute between 2 engineering consultancies, design firms, that both designed earth dams, and they had a dispute over a contract. And I had worked with both companies before on previous projects, and they both respected me, and so they asked me to actually arbitrate between them. And the good thing was that in the midst of that arbitration trial, they were actually able to mediate a solution where both sides were happy. So that was fantastic. But there's a lot of stuff that needs to go into a tender document, isn't there? Well, that's why tender documents tend to be fairly bulky things. That's why the $20 million project that I tendered out as part of a tender committee, that was about 2,000 pages. There's a lot of different parts involved to a tender document. So these are just where you would find tender documents. So you can see the URL up ahead. That's iqtenders.com. This is for tendering in Iraq. So this is actually an association that if you're a government agency or you're an engineer of sorts and you want to tender out work, you can post your tender invitations online and contractors can come and submit tenders online. That's the way the modern world is working now. So you don't need to look far here to realize there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of civil engineering opportunity in the north of Iraq. There is a lot, because after ISIS, after Daesh and the war, there is a lot of refurbishment and rehabilitation projects, and they just can't find good engineers and good construction companies to do this work. They really can't. So there's a rehabilitation of schools there, 4 schools in Sinjar, and then a school in Anbar as well. They need to be reinstated and fixed up so kids can go to school again. And at the bottom you've also got the rehabilitation of war-damaged houses and public facilities in Iraq, and that's a country-wide project. So there's one example of where you can find examples of tender invitations and tender documents. That's at iqtenders.com. This is another one. This is for the Kurdistan Regional Governorate's Ministry of Construction and Housing. So if you look at the title there, you can see they've got their contents bar with home, news, projects, related issues, contracts, but they also have something called tenders. And there you've got all of your tenders that they are currently looking for contractors for. So this is one. This is for an expression of interest, EOI, for consultancy services for preparing tender documents for design review and supervision of the Mateen Tunnel. So the Mateen Tunnel is a project that the KRG wants to do in the next few years, and they're at the very early stage of project definition and maybe a little bit into the planning. But basically it will be a 4.5 kilometer tunnel that will go through certain mountains in Dohuk, I believe, and it's going to basically mean that Dohuk, Barzan, all around that area, the travelling is going to get a lot shorter. Rather than having to go over the big hills, over Amidi and places, there will be a tunnel that will go right through the mountain. So an expression of interest, they are basically looking for people who could potentially be involved in preparing tender documents, design review and supervision of the Mateen Tunnel. So they're actually tendering the job of preparing the tender documents for designing and then construction of the Mateen Tunnel. It's circular. So yeah, there's a tender for preparing tender documents, if you like. And I've actually put that tender invitation for you on Moodle. So check that out. It sounds like a very interesting project. Maybe some of you might even be interested in bidding for this. If you if you're interested in contract documentation, tender documents, maybe you could actually you could bid for this. Who knows? So this is another page. So this one is actually from an NGO called Reconstruction Funds for Areas Affected by Terrorist Organizations. So that is refato.iq. So this is basically a committee where NGOs, non-government organizations, can basically announce tenders, and they can invite people to tender for certain contracts. So check out that website if you have time. And so this is at the bottom of the Refato website. What have we got here? We've got a tender announcement for the reconstruction of extension to the Al-Haqlania Directorate, the Zaigdan Village Road in Al-Anbar. Okay, so this will be building a 1.4 kilometer road. Do you want to actually be involved in the construction of that? Well, form your own construction company and then you can actually tender for that work. And if you click on that little tab at the bottom for details, it will probably give you the tender documents for that. The reconstruction and rehabilitation of 10 schools in Nineveh. Again, as I said, there is a lot of reconstruction and rehabilitation projects in North Iraq at the moment. Daesh have done a lot to stimulate the civil engineering industry. Not that I support Daesh, but they've created a lot of work for us. There's no reason why any of you should be unemployed come the end of your graduation. And then the reconstruction of the electric station in Al-Karawan in Nineveh as well. And if you go to this page, you'll find there's probably 20 or 30 civil engineering projects at any given time. So this one is also interesting. This one is actually from the website for the United Nations Development Programme. So the UN is an NGO which is basically trying to rehabilitate and develop the developing world. So if you go to procurement-notices.undp.org, you're going to have a number of different tenders that you can look at. So this one again is for the rehabilitation of Mujahid Al Arabi private school. I believe that's a school in Mosul. It got damaged in the war, and the UNDP are sponsoring the rehabilitation of that. And so you can go there, you can find out certain things. So if you look at the third line there, you've got a deadline, the deadline for when your tender should be submitted. And then beneath that, you've got all these links to all of the tender documents. So a guide for bidders for e-tendering, because it's all done online, the bill of quantities, drawings, compliance sheets, general technical specifications, that gives you more technical detail than drawings give you, and then SOW. What does SOW stand for? I have no idea what SOW stands for. You can find out by clicking on that. And then also the returnable bidding forms. And then finally you've got general information about the project and what specifically you're being asked to do. So all of those points I pointed to before about what needs to be included in the tender documents, that should be listed in those tabs. So check it out if you've got time. So remember I mentioned to you the earnest money deposit. What is the earnest money deposit? Well, let's say I am a contractor and I want to bid on a project. I've clicked on one of those websites and I've decided to submit a tender. I want to try and bid for that work. Well, let's say that there is something in the contract that says earnest money deposit. That means that when I submit my tender, I also send in with my tender some money. And this is the earnest money deposit. And it's usually in the vicinity of 1 to 2% of the contract price. That will be stipulated in the contract documents, the tender documents, as to what the EMD should be. Now, if I get awarded the contract, that means I will be refunded this EMD, this earnest money deposit, when I complete the project or at agreed stages. Or if I don't get awarded the contract and my tender is not accepted, they will resend my earnest money deposit. So what is the purpose of doing this? Well, it's to make sure that you're serious. Because if the engineer awards you the tender as the contractor, and then you go, nah. Well, first off, you're in breach of you've broken the law, because when you submit your tender, that is a legally binding contract. That means that you've already accepted to do the work, and all that you're waiting for is for the engineer to accept your tender. So if you refuse to do the work, you will not be refunded the EMD. And so this is a way to make sure that everyone who submits their tenders, they are serious. They are serious that they will honour their tenders if they are awarded the work. Now, so it's a way of making sure that you don't get, we have a saying in English, tire kickers. People who just think, maybe we could do that work, and then they submit a tender and they're not really thinking about how serious they are about it. Or maybe they submit a tender and they are serious about it, but they completely underestimated the cost. And now they have to honour that contract. They have to honour that tender. Well, they could argue, we didn't realise it would cost this much. It's not fair. It's not fair. Well, it is fair because you were given the same information as everyone else to work out what you were willing to do the project for. And so the EMD is a way of making sure people honour their contracts. They honour the tenders that they submit. Because remember, the contractor does not need to accept his own tender when he's been awarded the contract, the tender. No, he's already signed the acceptance letter when he submits the tender. All that is waiting is for the buyer, the engineer, to sign the acceptance letter. So that's why we have earnest money deposits. And I'll have to say that they exist for most civil engineering projects that are of a certain value. I would say anything above $1 million, there would be some sort of earnest money deposit usually. And it's just a way to make sure the contractors are serious. Now, for really big projects, what about that motorway project I told you before about in estimating, where I worked on it and it was worth 120 million? Well, if you had a 1% earnest money deposit, then that would be $1.2 million. That's a huge amount of money. How are you going? Maybe the contractor just can't handle not having that money in his bank account until the completion of the project. In that case, for really big projects, they will refund the EMD, the earnest money deposit, at agreed stages. We will give half the EMD when you complete this phase of the project and the other half when you complete the entire phase. And that would all be stipulated in the tender documents. So This is something that I have a real concern for Kurdistan. As I said, earnest money deposits are a really good way of making sure you have serious bidders, you have serious contractors. But as far as I can tell, in Kurdistan, when I look at documents and tender documents in Kurdistan, especially government tenders, they don't have earnest money deposits stipulated. Instead, they will have a tender fee. So the Ministry of Oil and Gas, in most of their tender documents, if it's a 100,000 plus project for the contract, they will say this: the fee for submitting a tender is $5,000. That means that if you want to bid for the work, you have to pay a price. You have to pay a fee. And in this case, it's $5,000. And they say, well, this is a way to make sure we only get serious bidders. And I think that is such a stupid thing to do. The reason they do this, rather than having earnest money deposits, is because they think they can raise revenue, they can earn some money for whatever they're doing. It's a way of taxing. But it is such a foolish thing to do, because basically they are actually going to end up paying more. So I'll try and explain this. If this doesn't make sense to you, I will explain this on the board when we have our Zoom tutorial or when we're back in class. But let's say the Ministry of Oil and Gas has a project where they want to build a pipeline. And so they put out a tender invitation with the tender documents for prospective contractors. And there are 5 contractors, 5 contracting companies that bid for it. Now, these contracting companies, I'm going to call them Avan Construction, Yar Engineering, Taba Consultancy, Cardo Civil Engineering Services, okay? So yeah, those are the 5 companies. Now, let's say you all price the work. You're about to submit your tenders, and you price the work, and you all determine that the work is going to be around $100,000. Now, you need to submit your tender and pay $5,000. Now, the ministry, they think they are so smart. They think 5 people are going to bid, we're going to make $25,000. They're idiots. They really are. What's going to happen? Cardo is going to say, okay, I think the work is going to cost me $100,000 with my profit margin and everything else, but it's going to cost me $5,000 to submit the tender. So already the cost goes up to $105,000. But not only that, Cardo is thinking, I only have a 1 in 5 chance of actually winning the project, because I know Avan, Yar, Lausanne, Taba, they're all submitting tenders as well. Therefore, I'm running a risk. And remember what we learnt about? If there's higher risk, you want higher profits. We learnt that in engineering economics. It's 101. Therefore, probably Cardo is going to say, if I only have a 1 in 5 chance of winning this project and I'm going to lose $5,000, that means the final tender price I'm going to submit is probably going to be around $140,000. So I have a 4 in 5 chance, an 80% chance of losing $5,000, but I have a 20% chance of making $40,000 or $50,000 more than my usual profit margin. So he's basically buying a lottery ticket. Cardo, Avan, Taba, Yar, Lausanne, they are all going to think the same thing. They are all going to submit tenders, probably around 140, 150,000. So the Ministry of Oil and Gas is thinking, we're so smart, we've made $25,000, but now the tenders that have been submitted are now $40,000 to $50,000 more in cost than what they would have been. So who's actually making money here? Not the Ministry of Oil and Gas. It's just such a foolish way of doing business. It's such a foolish way of doing civil engineering. They should be using, instead, to make sure that the contractors are serious, they should be using earnest money deposits. That's what they should be doing. But anyway, that's a side note. That's a big issue in Kurdistan. They charge a fee for the privilege of offering a service. It would be a bit like me going into Abu Afif ice cream and the manager saying, "Would you like an ice cream, sir?" and me saying, "Well, I want you to pay me $5 to show me your ice creams before I decide if I'm going to buy them or not." What's that manager going to do? He's going to say, "Get lost." And yet that seems to be happening in civil engineering and the tendering process in Kurdistan. It's not just the Ministry of Oil and Gas, it's also with other ministries. Construction and housing, this is happening too, to a lesser degree. So I now want to talk to you about something else, another clause in the tender documents, and that is liquidated damages and penalty for late delivery. Now, if we have a late delivery, that means the project, the scope is not being met. If I was building you a house, Taba, and I finish the house in 10 years' time, even if it's low cost and it's high quality, you're going to be pretty miffed at me. A house shouldn't take 10 years to build. So in order to make sure that the contractor has good time management and the cost quality time constraints for the scope of works are being met, you could be offering in the tender documents a penalty for late delivery. This is called liquidated damages. So an example, and you can't just say in the tender documents, for every day that you are overdue on the delivery date, I am going to take off your fee, off your final fee, $1 million. You can't do that. That would be unfair. You need to make sure that the penalties that you're stipulating, they are proportional to the opportunity cost for late delivery. So let's talk about that. You know about opportunity cost from engineering economics, but let's say you are the sponsor. You are the engineer, the one. You're the one buying. You're the one submitting. Presenting a tender invitation to prospective contractors, and the work is for building a shopping mall. Now, you've got a very clear scope of works for the shopping mall, and so part of that is the shopping mall needs to be up and running at a certain date. And so you tell the contractors in the tender document, you need to have them all finished by this date. Now, once the mall is open, you're going to be getting rent of $10,000 every week. Now, that means if you are late, if the contractor is late in delivering the project by 1 week, you have lost in opportunity cost $10,000 because you've forsaken that rent. So what can you do? Well, you can say in your penalties for late delivery, for every week that you are late from the deadline for finishing this work, $10,000 will be deducted from your payment. And that will mean that the contractor has an incentive to work and to deliver the work on time. Now, those penalties, that they need to be proportional to the cost, the opportunity cost for late delivery, but it can include externals. So let's say you're the government and you're the engineer for the government and you're trying to get contractors to bid for a tender to build a motorway. Well, the opportunity cost of a late delivery isn't really going to be felt by you because you're not going to be charging rent. Drivers aren't going to pay money every time they go on the motorway, but there will be an external cost. The economic stimulation that motorway will provide will be forsaken for another week if the project is delivered a week later. So if you can quantify those externals, remember we talked a little bit about that when we talked about feasibility studies and cost-benefit analysis. Those external opportunity costs can be the basis for a penalty. Now, you can have a penalty for late delivery. That's a penalty for poor time management, but equally you could have a penalty for poor quality management, and that is a type of liquidated damage too. Let's say that I'm building, I'm the Ministry of Electricity, and I'm tendering out to prospective contractors work to build a new renewable energy wind farm. Now, in the scope of works, this wind farm is supposed to produce 25 megawatts of energy. But because of poor quality of work, it only produces 24.5 megawatts of energy. That means you're losing 500 kilowatts of energy, of power. And so that means there's less money for you as the Ministry of Electricity. Well, you could actually charge a penalty that is proportional to the lost opportunity of 25,000 of having 25 megawatts. So those are types of liquidated damages. Now, the key thing is that the penalties need to be proportional to the felt loss. The lost opportunity, they need to be proportional to the opportunity cost of the late delivery or the low quality. If they are over and above that, then it's not legally binding. You can't just make any old figure up and say, I charge you a penalty of $1 million for every day overdue you have for not delivering my house, or so forth. It needs to be proportional. So guys, I think that's probably enough for now. I've been lecturing you for an hour and a quarter now. So make sure you take notes, make sure you understand everything that I've covered so far. But for supplementary study, go to Moodle, and there are some tender documents for 2 different tenders which are currently, these are active, they are from Kurdistan, they are real. There's one for building a water supply tank and service room for Hardin Village. I think that's in Nineveh. And then there's also the tender for making an expression of interest for consultancy services. That means for preparing tender documents for parts of the project, and also design review and just general project management for the Mateen Tunnel in Dohuk. Check those out, and they're available on Moodle. The typical tender process, there's a website that I've put on Moodle too. That can probably wait until the end of the next lecture. So guys, thank you so much for your time, and I will see you later. Bye.